Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Confronting Third-Party Risks in a Decentralized Organization. But before we begin, I want to bring your attention to our next webinar, which will take place on October 25th, an executive guide to third-party financial risk management. If you are interested or would like to learn more information about this webinar, please go to www.hiperos.com, and on the home page, if you scroll down to the bottom into the News and Events section, you can register and learn more about this webinar. So before we dive into today's topic, please, I just want to take a minute to give you some information about Hiperos. We are very pleased and honored to sponsor today's event. And for those of you who are new to us, Hiperos is a SaaS company, or a software as a service company, and we are the market leader in third-party management. Our technology is used by some of the largest companies and brands in the world, plus industry consortiums, to help manage complexities of doing business with tens and hundreds of thousands of third parties. And when we say a third party, we mean vendors, suppliers, contractors, manufacturers on the cost side of the balance sheet, and we're also talking about brokers, distributors, sales agents, channel partners on the revenue side, and all these third parties that make up your extended enterprise. And every third party carries with it some risk associated with it, risk that can affect regulatory adherence, revenue, and your reputation. So our customers rely on us to help them assess these third-party risks and to manage that risk across the entire organization. So with that, we'll go on to our webinar for today. Our speaker for today is Matt Kelly. He's the CEO and editor of the compliance blog Radical Compliance. Matt is a longtime observer of corporate compliance, and we are very excited to have him here today. So Matt, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Sure, thank you very much. Let me just make sure that I have control here. Looks like I do. Let me move my screen back up. It looks like we might have some problem with control here. Let me see. All right, here we go. I'm sorry, everybody, for the technical delay. So, hello. Thank you for tuning in today. I certainly appreciate it. And thank you to Hiperos for hosting me. It's always a pleasure to talk to compliance professionals, and so I hope you do find today useful. As Sharon said, what I'm here to do today is talk about risk management at decentralized organizations. And I suspect many of you either work at them or you encounter them quite often. And since a big part of that is challenge around third-party management, I think we probably have lots of ground to cover here. A little bit about me. As Sharon said, I am Matt Kelly, and I am a longtime observer of and writer about corporate compliance issues. These days, I run my own blog about compliance and GRC topics at radicalcompliance.com. Some people sometimes ask the significance of that name. Really, it only means that, number one, that was the first website name that was available, and number two, it sounded kind of cool, so I registered it, and that's where I am. You might also know me from my prior work at Compliance Week. I was editor there for 10 years and a contributing writer for 2 years before that. So in one form or another, I've been writing about or commenting on corporate compliance issues probably since about 2003 and seen quite a lot. These days, I also do a fair amount of research and thought leadership as well, so you might see my name from time to time out in the big GRC world. I do some writing of white papers and whatnot, and a small bit of corporate consulting and talk about compliance issues privately with some private clients as well. Mostly what I like to say right about now in a webinar is that I really do love this stuff. I think that the issues your audience, this audience grapples with is endlessly fascinating. So anytime anybody does want to shoot the breeze about a compliance issue that is on your mind, always feel free to give me a shout. A little bit then about what I would like us to cover today. I wanted to start by taking a very macroeconomic view of what decentralization is and where it comes from. And kind of focus a bit on Why decentralized organizations? Why is this a thing today? Why now? Why not 5 years ago? Why not sometime in the future? And really dive into what is driving the push for corporate enterprises to be decentralized. I think that's important, and I think it's important to dissect because it really illuminates the environment that compliance officers face and why you do have the challenges and problems you do with third-party risks and running a compliance program more generally. As you can see from my second point here, I do believe that decentralization brings a considerable amount of tension and challenge to a compliance officer's job. And I also want to stress here that some of the challenge relates directly to third parties. And I know that Hiperos is a specialty in third-party oversight, and that's an issue dear to the hearts of most of you listening today. But some of the challenge is true simply at any decentralized organization, regardless of how many third parties you do or you don't use. So a lot of what I am going to talk about today, I'll be using phrases like the local business units or third parties almost interchangeably. I think a lot of the challenge for all of you, the chief compliance officers or compliance executives at your organizations, it's more about the nature of the decentralized organization itself. So after that, then I will dive, I promise, into some specifics about what these challenges are. I think compliance officers in this environment have some real problems with corporate culture, as well as IT and data governance, and how you can make those elements of your compliance effort work well in the environment that you have. I think that you have challenges with risk assessment, and specifically how the same threat gets viewed differently in various parts of the organization. And I think that can pose some real problems for the compliance officer. So that's going to be another key point that we were going to explore today. And then finally, I want to look at some of the policy management challenges that I think exist here. And I'll set aside some time for some Q&A. Although I'm a big fan of questions as they arise, so if you do have a question, always feel free to submit it at any time while I'm talking, and we'll try to see if we can answer them on the fly and get to as many questions as we can. So with that, let's get rolling here. Why decentralization right now? So first, I wanted to look at the appeal of decentralization more from the CEO's perspective. And really, from his or her point of view, decentralization is a good idea. It's got a lot going for it. You can empower local business units, and of course, as we all read best practices in business magazines and whatnot, everybody's always for local empowerment. You can cut operation costs, and that certainly pleases the CFO and the board. You can save on integration costs, and that can sometimes save a lot of money, definitely. But cutting integration costs, it's just as important that can save a company time and manpower for all the decision making that goes into making an integration project work well. Decentralization gives you more agility in supply chains, and that is one point where third parties specifically can be really important. Rather than build out a supply chain that your enterprise owns and controls entirely, I guess you can say that you could rent links of the chain by working with more suppliers who are closer to your local needs. You can also get shorter delivery times to your customer if local business units are sourcing local products, working with local third parties to make their local products and then sell that final offering to the local customer. Doesn't this sound great and wonderful? It does. So that's the logic from the perspective of a single company about why are we decentralizing? You can even say that it's somewhat of a macroeconomic look at the appeal of decentralization because, like I said, it's got a lot of appeal, regardless of the external climate. That said, let's actually look at the external climate because I do think that it brings a lot to bear as well. The external business climate that's happening today makes decentralization a lot more appealing. And I mean that whether you are outsourcing various functions and increasing your third-party numbers, or even if you are just acquiring local units or giving local units more autonomy, it's not so much delegating authority back to local units, it's building up a global enterprise that's really more like a collection of autonomous units. That's what's happening here. The big reason for why this is happening, the reason that is always fixed in your boss's heads, is sluggish economic growth. Full stop. What do your board, what do your CEO and CFO think about all the time? That's it. For many businesses in the U.S., I know that growth isn't terribly sluggish here in the United States. I would not necessarily call it robust growth either. It is what it is. And growth overseas is really where sluggish applies. The other factor is that because of sluggish growth, bankers have cut interest rates, and now think about what that means for all of us at these big enterprises. More companies loading up on relatively cheap debt, going on acquisition sprees because they can't find that organic internal growth in their own companies. So that's when you do go looking for M&A targets, and large companies will either acquire complementary smaller firms to plug holes in their product offerings. So that might be a large pharmaceutical company looking to acquire a biotech in a specific type of disease, for example, or a professional services firm wanting to add a new type of expertise to what it offers to clients. So you can certainly see that kind of M&A activity. Or you can buy your way into emerging markets because you want to reach new customers. And those emerging markets tend to be much more volatile than North America or Europe and what we're accustomed to. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying all of these forces here are, they're what lead to the type of corporate enterprise we see today. It's lots of operating units sprawled all over the globe. Like I said before, even for companies with few third parties, this structure of being rather sprawling and sort of an amalgamation of business units, that can be very challenging for compliance officers. And when you add in third parties, which most large companies now have thousands of third parties, that really makes this all the worse. None of this is going to go away anytime soon. And that is one point I like to stress with compliance audiences I talk to, that this is the normal, and this, for better or worse, whether you like it or not, like this is your landscape for the rest of your career. This is what we're going to deal with. I did have some M&A data I just wanted to show to kind of exemplify the point.
Matt, can I interrupt with a question?
Yeah.
So you may sort of have just answered it, but I want to ask it anyway because I think it's a very good point.
Yeah.
So the question is, do you think the push to decentralization is permanent or a pendulum that will swing the other way eventually due to factors like increased growth?
I don't want to sound negative, but I think that it's going to be this way for a long time. I don't want to go too much down the macroeconomic rabbit hole, but when you think of what would we need for big, strong growth, we would need much more dynamic emerging markets, and they still have so much political instability that leads to an inability to stabilize the business climate and get them growing, which are all of the consumer markets you might want. You have to think about demographic challenges, like we have aging societies in the United States, Europe, Russia, China, Japan. That's a lot of people. That is a lot of future customers and consumers and businesses that are going to be partners in business-to-business transaction. Like, until we see that, a much more dynamic sort of social environment where there are more people around, where we see a stronger political stability in emerging markets, I don't know if that's going to happen. If we see higher interest rates, which would cool M&A activity, but you typically only see them in a recession anyways. It's not like we would necessarily want that. Like, there's a lot of forces here that, like I said before, I think this is going to be permanent. I think this is a function of life. And maybe specifically to third parties, you also have to remember, at least at a certain theoretical level, it's supposed to be easier now to herd all of your third parties to do something. We have much more advanced information technology than we did 30 years ago. Now, we all know in practice it gets to be a lot harder because a lot of your units pick up third parties and put them aside, and they forget to tell compliance, and the vetting process can be loosey-goosey, and I'll get into that later on. But there are numerous forces to make this look like and feel like this is as good as it gets. It's not awful by any stretch of the imagination. It's just very challenging and different than what we would have seen 20 or 30 years ago. That's why it's a headache today. So I hope that answers the question. This M&A data that I do have on the screen now, this, like I said, this is just to show the scope of how much growth there is in M&A, and for every M&A deal that happens, that's a new business unit that gets grafted onto an enterprise somewhere, and some chief compliance officer has to think about, how do I handle this? You can see that total dollar value worldwide in M&A has almost doubled in the last 5 years. I don't think that's going away anytime soon. We still see interest rates extremely low around the world, and it's very easy for a board and a CEO to think we will grow by M&A, grow strategically rather than grow organically, because there just isn't enough demand in the world. And I don't know what 2016's numbers are, but I suspect that this upward trend is, this is going to be the trend line for a while. And all of that means, like I said, more operating units, more third parties, more compliance officers tuning into our webinars, because I think this is going to be a very challenging and interesting environment. Let's see. Next, I wanted to bring in some findings from a recent study by Deloitte, looking at the challenges of third-party governance, specifically at decentralized organization. I'll have a link to this study at the end of these slides. And I'd encourage you to give this study a read when you can, because I do think it's quite worthwhile. This was a survey of 170 senior corporate leaders at large organizations. As you can see, a large number of them say decentralization is either part of their operation already, or it's going to be part of their operation in the future. So that really emphasizes the point that I made earlier, that this environment is here to stay. But I think the real key for all of you as compliance officers is the second bullet point about how corporations will work in the future if this is the decentralized environment. What do you need to be able to make a large company that's somewhat sprawling with a lot of third parties? How does that work? If the local units have more power to decide how to act, the big enterprise wants to define standard processes for how those decisions get made. And it wants those local units to reside on some sort of central file of data as often as possible. So right away, a nice, easy example is that you'll want a standard policy for how people vet third parties. And you'll want all of those local leaders to go and tap some central data that you have about, here's all that we have on our third parties, a preferred vendor list or a screening tool or something like that. You do not want them doing this on their own. Otherwise, you wind up with a very fractious sort of approach to third-party oversight. I think that's an important point for compliance officers to digest, and it's very relevant to your job that, we're talking about how do you strengthen a business process, especially the process to make decisions, and above all, processes on how to bring in new third parties. They need to be defined clearly. You need to pull from some sort of central repository of facts and data about third parties that the central compliance function gets to control. But really, we're thinking, how do we make business decisions very, I don't want to say rote, but have a certain muscle memory, so to speak, in what the local units will be doing to vet third parties, hire third parties, decide what is or isn't out, how they bring in central compliance to help them out with something. I like that metaphor of muscle memory. You know what you're supposed to do, even though every situation in every unit is going to be a little bit different this quarter than last. But how do you standardize that process? So where does all of this leave the compliance team? I think it introduces, like I said, a few tensions into your life. So let's dive a bit deeper into those. Another great survey that I like to talk about here, and this is the last survey I'll cite, I promise you, but PwC's annual survey of CEOs at global enterprises, and they do a good job with this survey. This one is pretty comprehensive. They asked CEOs what worries them the most as they search for growth. And as you can see, the regulatory compliance challenges were the biggest obstacle that they cited. That was it. You know, all the CEOs, what are you panicking about? I panic about regulation and regulatory compliance. Bigger than geopolitical uncertainty. But as you can see from my little bottom line there, if you put these two forces together, these two statements, along with that big macroeconomic picture that we just sketched out a while ago, then start to ponder what all this means to you. We get to here. This is the big fundamental tension I think a lot of businesses and compliance officers are trying to resolve. Or maybe you might want to say a better analogy, it's more like the tightrope you're trying to walk, the balance you need to strike. The company wants to be more decentralized. It wants more operating units to act more nimbly. It wants to outsource and bring in more third parties to handle its operations, all so it can find growth more effectively. Sounds great. Then, however, you're trying to normalize all of these business processes so the whole enterprise can manage regulatory compliance more effectively, more uniformly. And like I say, I don't see that these forces can peaceably coexist in the same universe. Each one pushes the company in opposite directions. If you want full decentralization, that's contrary to the group level accountability and regulatory compliance companies say that they want. On the other hand, if you want full lockstep regulatory compliance, sounds great, except it's contrary to the freedom of decentralization that we all say that we'd like. Now, this is probably where some of you are starting to wonder, like, okay, we're 25 minutes into this webcast. When do we get to the talk really about third parties? We haven't talked about them that much. So where's the beef? Well, we're going to get to the beef momentarily, but I do like to spend time on a lot of this because I think really a deep understanding of all of this is crucial for compliance officers, almost as a personal development sort of a goal. To be more effective with your peers, to be more effective with your bosses, to advance your careers and all of this, it really bears understanding what is the world that we're working in. And I think the question really isn't, what do I do? What do you do for screening this third party, investigating that or something? These are solving the problems of today. And I don't dismiss the problems of today, but really skillful management of third-party risks amid these decentralized organizations. That's really a question of more like, how do I manage this? What are the skills to succeed? And they're going to be much more about good office politics, good balancing of different constituencies, and keeping all of the moving parts together as you're trying to run a compliance program across so many different areas, so many different operating units you do control, so many third parties you don't control, but they're still in your greater enterprise ecosystem, that sort of a thing. You really need a deep mastery of how did we get here and how is this going to work, no matter what company I'm at or what my industry is, because you're going to change industries and companies over time. What are the skills you need? So that's why I spend so much time on that. But now that I've given my impassioned speech on the soapbox, I'll get a little bit more granular, like I promised. So the way to think about decentralization, and the mental tool I would recommend, the one that I talk about a lot, is to think about compliance and risk in your organization specifically. Picture the enterprise and all of its risks kind of like a waterbed. And I know that's a little bit of a weird metaphor to use, but the point is that when you push down on one part of a waterbed, something else elsewhere, some other part of it is going to bulge back up. That's the dynamic you need to keep in your head. As we push decision-making power and more autonomy downward in the organization? What risks are going to push back upward into your office, into the central area, that you, the CEO, all of your other friends in the second line of defense up in central management, you guys are going to have to deal with this. That's what you need to think about. If we're pushing power down here, something else is going to come back up that I'm going to have to grapple with. So what is it? Obviously, every company will have different risks that rise up to different degrees depending upon your own unique circumstances. I get that. This is a question you're going to have to answer for yourself. But that said, we can make a few broad observations, and here they are up on my slide. First, decentralization challenges the notion of a single corporate culture. I don't mean to say it contradicts it. It's just merely it makes it harder to support a single corporate culture. I like to think decentralization more breeds opportunity for mini cultures, or in the case of third parties, they really don't have much connection to your culture at all, necessarily. So we're going to get into that in another slide or two. Second, you need to pay a lot more attention to IT projects and data management. If you have different systems or different ways of classifying data, and all that data needs to be understood and managed by people like you there in central command, you're going to have to think about how do we get a good system going for that. Third is the risk assessment and how one risk can be perceived in different ways by different parts of the enterprise, and I think that is an important point that can trip up a lot of what chief compliance officers want to try to achieve. And then that brings you lastly to policy management challenges and communicating and enforcing policy across many different points of the enterprise. So as a corollary to all that, all of these forces also apply to your third parties. How do you bring them into the fold of a single enterprise when they're not really part of your enterprise? That's another big challenge. So we can start to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Let's see. Challenges to culture. I put this first because ultimately a compliance organization and the enterprise overall, you live and you die on the success of your corporate culture. And I know we all talk about cultivating a strong ethical culture. Of course, I am a big fan of strong ethical cultures, as are we all, but let's remember the reality that the more you decentralize, or the more you rely on third parties, the bigger your challenge will be in fostering a strong corporate culture. These forces of decentralization, relying heavily on third parties, they really do move against that idea of a strong corporate culture. You need to invest more strength in it if that's what you want to do. I'm going to give what I think is a very vivid example of what I mean here in Uber and Lyft, or similar companies that rely on the gig economy as a business model. They have a real challenge in trying to delineate where their culture begins and ends, and likewise the responsibility for their third parties. Technically, for Uber and Lyft, you could say that their drivers are third parties because they're not employees. But really, when misconduct happens with one of their drivers, all of that goes out the window, and all of the customers and people like you and me, as we're reading the news, say, oh yeah, did you hear about that Uber driver in the news? Now, you can say the same also for businesses like McDonald's that rely heavily on a franchise model, or any others like that where there isn't a direct line of control. The weaker you are at creating a single corporate culture, the more your firm's reputation risks go up. And that point here in my notes here, like I've underlined and italicized that because I do think that is important. You could even say Wells Fargo is an example as well. It didn't involve third parties, but think about what happened with Wells Fargo and its scandal of employees creating fictional accounts. They fired 5,300 people over the course of 5 years. I think that they created about 2 million fake accounts out of hundreds of millions, I think. Wells Fargo is an enormous bank. The point being, the failures that happened at Wells weren't material to the whole organization. Wells Fargo is a big bank, but because it was a failure more of its corporate culture, its reputation got shot square in the head over this. I mean, they really took it in the face with their reputation. It is a big problem. The CEO just resigned. It is that sort of a thing that a weak corporate culture can create, a high risk of reputational damage, even if what goes wrong isn't terribly material to the company. We've seen plenty of other material forms of misconduct that have also been terrible for the corporate reputation, and we can go back to Enron and Arthur Andersen and the rest for that. But nonetheless, that's something to think about. If you are decentralized, you need to really step up your attention to corporate culture. And somebody might ask you, well, why do we need to do this? Why does the CEO need to talk about it all the time? Because the reputation risks go up and up and up the weaker your culture is. So you always need to be looking at defense mechanisms around that. So, next big strain. The next strain is on IT projects and data management. If your operations are decentralized, either through a lot of M&A deals you've done, or you give a lot of control to your autonomous business units around the world and how they structure their IT systems, or you have a heavy reliance on third parties who have their own ways of doing things you might not necessarily know at all, then you, the CCO, you need to think about IT and data integration issues all the time. All of the time. From all of my compliance officer friends and contacts, I know, for example, one person at a large, highly acquisitive pharmaceutical firm, that compliance officer had to deal with 55 different business software systems to try and wrestle all of that into her compliance needs. That's the record, 55 systems. If your company has more than 55 software systems you use, that's a new record. Let me know. I'll send you a Radical Compliance t-shirt. But it gives you a sense of the challenge here, which I personally believe is difficult for compliance officers, because a lot of compliance officers do come from legal backgrounds. They do not necessarily teach IT integration and data governance at law school, but this is where you really do need to think about these kind of issues. You need to think about, for example, data governance. Most companies still don't have a data governance function, nothing that's quite defined that way or clearly delineated and outlined and named as data governance. They don't have a good data governance specialist. I see that sometimes now in financial services. I have seen it a little bit less, but I have seen it at pharmaceutical firms. Usually, if you don't have a full-time data governance or chief data officer, what happens? Well, it gets assigned to the data department, or the IT department somehow. That's great. I think that IT departments know how to do data management well, but they may not be as familiar with regulatory compliance needs as you are. So, that's part of the element that you need to think about here. And for third parties specifically, you need to think about how do you collect all the data that they give you, or the data that you will need to extract from them. That might even be a better way to put it. Is it something that goes to the first line of defense business units who are recruiting all of these third parties? Do you want to assign that job to a procurement department at your company? I know that assumes that you actually have a procurement department, which a lot of companies do not necessarily do. Or if you have a central procurement department, does that run against the notion of a decentralized structure? Are there smaller procurement departments in local units you're going to have to reach out to? Data governance challenges here, plus the headache of extensive regulation and the fast pace of regulatory change, that all can come together into a big headache for probably, I think, my third data point, bullet point here down near the bottom about IT strategy. I will say I'm not here today to endorse or recommend any specific GRC vendor, not Hiperos or anyone else, but given the vast and fluid compliance landscape that compliance officers are facing, you need to think about how you can manage your data governance tasks with the IT that you have, or if you want to move to a different structure of IT strategy. So what do I mean? For example, what you really want to do with all of this data governance that you have is you want to offload your spreadsheet risks. That's where a lot of your trouble is. It is an incorrect piece of data somehow sneaking into a spreadsheet somewhere that you control and you don't know about it. And the more data governance you do, you personally, your company, the more spreadsheet risk that you have. So would you want to move from a big enterprise IT system like Oracle or SAP or some other enterprise system that you own? Do you want to use a totally different approach of various vendors all existing in the cloud, somewhat interoperating, and all of them give you the information you need when you need it? That would help the compliance officer out quite a lot, is to move away from a big in-house IT on-premises strategy to more of tapping in and renting IT when you need it for all of your compliance that is provided by vendors out there on the cloud. That's the sort of strategic thinking about IT that you're going to need to answer. You're going to need to figure this out. You probably could do all of that with Oracle or SAP. I'm not disputing that they can't handle this challenge. But is that what you want? Is that what's best for your company? Is that what gets rid of the third-party risk and the compliance risk that you have? Clearly, you need to collaborate a lot with your IT department, your IT security department, internal audit, and finance, and others, but it's something that you need to think about. In the interest of time, I will move on a bit now to risk assessments. So one other big main point I want to convey here, and part of the reason why I put this towards the end, is I want to convey the sense of how one risk can be perceived in various ways. And that makes the job of the compliance officer very difficult, because your boss at a large enterprise wants the whole risk to be managed in some unitary form. And I'm not really sure that's how a lot of risk management works, especially risks that are in vogue today. And I'll use an example of what I mean here. The big popular risk we all have, I'm sure it's all in our minds, is the risk of your third parties violating some anti-bribery statute on your behalf. FCPA risk in your third parties. We all get that. I'm sure it's all on your minds. To people in the central office, people down the hall from you in the corporate headquarters, FCPA risk among third parties is very much a compliance and a reputation risk. That is how the CEO and the board, the general counsel, you, your finance people, that is how you tend to see it. If you have an FCPA problem, your intersection with it is more compliance-based and perhaps reputation-based if it's going to be a really unpleasant thing that people have to talk about. It can cost a lot of money to investigate. It can cost a lot more to settle. It can embarrass senior executives. It can harm the brand. As one example, we've all seen this come home to roost with Walmart, where it had FCPA allegations raised for its third parties in Mexico and elsewhere. So for the senior compliance team at Walmart, the people out in Arkansas, who I know and who I think are very talented and they're very energetic compliance officers, they would frame this problem as it's a compliance risk and a reputation risk. It is a litigation risk too. But that's how we, here in the second line of defense, that's how we perceive FCPA risks among third parties. Now, I belabor that point because that is not how the third parties themselves, or even your local operating units in the first line of defense, that's not how they would perceive FCPA risk in third parties. They would see this very much along the lines of, if I don't make my numbers, I might get fired, so I need to slip this local minister of whatever in my local jurisdiction. I need to slip this minister a little something to get the contract approved. They see this very same risk, FCPA risk in third parties, they all see all of this as an operational thing. They see it as an operations risk. They're not worried about the company's brand value. They're not worried about the cost of investigation. They're worried much more pragmatically about How do I help the company meet its operational objectives rather than its compliance objectives? Now that gets to my bottom question here at the bottom of the slide. And I don't have a good answer to this necessarily. How does the company establish group-level accountability for third-party risks when that risk means different things to different people? That's one point where, like I said, I don't necessarily have a good answer to it, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts in the Q&A portion about how you're approaching this, or even how on target you think this is. But I do believe that left to their own devices, a lot of third parties, a lot of local units, they don't necessarily want to bribe. They feel more like they have to bribe to help the company succeed, to help me succeed. And it's a totally different perspective for all of us, that we're worried about regulatory enforcement, we're worried about bad publicity. And how you bundle all of that, those two very different perceptions, into one thing for group-level accountability for third-party risk, that's tough. So I have a little bit more here. These are just a few questions a compliance officer can ask almost as a checklist, I would say, to make sure you're thinking about compliance risks at a decentralized operation, whether that's at a third-party risk or any other type of risk. Just a good checklist to make sure you're perceiving things the right way and perceiving them effectively. First, I would always keep a friendly line of communication open with your internal audit function. As the world moves forward into a future where we rely more on data, and where more business operations you have, they're really more about processing data than moving around boxes of things. That really gets to whether all of your business processes behave the way you want. And that's where internal audit is very useful. Remember what internal audit is good at doing. They're good at looking at a business process and seeing whether it's behaving according to some set of specified norms. Now, those norms can be compliance requirements as much as they can be anything else. So can you bake your compliance risks into the internal audit department's enterprise risk assessment? Second, are you involved in discussions about corporate strategy? Now, that really is important because PwC's State of Compliance Survey, which is not the survey I mentioned earlier from PwC, it's a different one. I'm sorry, I am mentioning a survey once more. But the PwC State of Compliance Survey came out recently. It's very authoritative. It found that only 36% of compliance officers who responded to the survey, only 36% of them said, we're really involved in corporate strategy. That is interesting because it flies in the face of the survey I did mention earlier, the CEO survey, where all the CEOs are running around saying growth in regulatory compliance is the biggest challenge to their success. They're really nervous about how to manage regulatory compliance worldwide, and yet only 36% of the compliance officers are in the room. If what the CEOs say is correct, then whatever the other portion of that is, 64% of CCOs, they're not in those conversations, and you have to wonder why. So think about how you are involved in corporate strategy, how you are not, how you might raise some of the concerns I mentioned earlier about if we decentralize, here's this, and this risk that will bubble up at our organization. So how are we going to try and control them? And then finally, however your risk assessment process works, are you addressing all of your risks correctly? That is, do you define the operational and compliance implications of the same risk, like we mentioned with FCPA risk and third parties? We have to remember third parties are not as attuned to your reputational risks as you are. Why would they be? They're not part of your company. But I'll take a different end. When it does happen, it is a tremendous hit to your reputation as a brand. It's never a hit to the actual human traffickers who are 4 levels down off the coast of Southeast Asia doing forced labor to collect food for your products that ultimately wind up on the store shelf. That was the problem that Nestle had. They knew that it was there and their brand was suffering, but they really couldn't figure out how do we get all the way down to a third, fourth, fifth party to get them to knock it off as an operational problem. How can you try and address all of that? I think that unless you define a risk correctly in all of its forms, you're really going to be unable to, you're going to struggle with adding the right controls to manage it. Sometimes those controls might be part culture, where a CEO talks more about ethical standards, or the CEO relaxes a high-pressure culture, which would have done Wells Fargo a world of good at some point in the past. Sometimes these controls that you're going to need, they will be technical. It will be local business units maybe collecting data from third parties, feeding it into a different sort of central IT system that you're going to have to build with your IT department and support from finance and the CFO. You know, there's always going to be a mix there. But unless you understand the different perceptions, different manifestations of the same risk across your big sprawling organization, your controls aren't necessarily going to be on point. Today, like I just said on the previous slide, how do you create group level accountability for third-party risks when the group, which is a nice thing to say, it looks great on a PowerPoint slide and it's a best practice, but the group is so decentralized, experiencing risk in different ways. How do you really tie that all back up together so that you can have some group level accountability way up at the highest levels of the organization? And like I said, I'm not really quite sure. So some key takeaways, and then we can get to any questions if you have them. Decentralization, I think economically it is always going to happen. I think it is going to be there for quite a while. Even, as I said earlier, if the economy does improve, our management of information is getting better all the time. So at least in theory, you could still run a lot of operations through outsourced providers that you kind of corral as the leader of an orchestra, rather than everybody marching in lockstep in one tightly owned organization. The more a company decentralizes, the more that's going to challenge the notion of a strong unified culture. You can still do it, but you're going to have to work at it, and your CEO is going to have to work at it as well. I think that different levels within the enterprise perceive the same behavior as different risks. Some of them will see it as a compliance risk, some will see it as an operations risk. You really need to understand how to parse that out. IT systems, data management, they are going to become hugely crucial, especially around third parties where you're going to be collecting information about them, vetting them in due diligence, and then ongoing monitoring. It's all about collecting data from them, centralizing it, understanding how to synthesize it, and then being able to decide some action based on what you have. And communication, culture, they are just going to be crucial. I think in the organization of the future, especially if it's decentralized, the autonomous units have more power. What does that leave the CEO doing? It leaves him or her going out there talking about culture, good ethical conduct, the importance of all of that to the brand a whole lot more. And like I said, I don't mean to pick on Wells Fargo that much, but it is a shame Wells could not have done that earlier. Perhaps if it had made some adjustments to its culture, it would not be probably the poster boy for ethical compliance concerns that we have in 2016, because by the end of the year, that's going to be the big one at the top. So I have some suggested reading here. I have some other posts related on my own blog, radicalcompliance.com, if you want to take a look at it. Other than that, I hope this has been informative for you, and if there are questions, I'm happy to keep going until the top of the hour or whenever Sharon cuts me off.
Hi, Matt. Sure. Could you take one question? Can you talk about local compliance officers and what the compliance organizational structure should look like?
Yeah. So ultimately, you're going to have to decide that for yourself. But I do think that if local units are going to be the eyes and ears of good conduct at your organization, it does lead to the question of, should there be a local compliance officer there? I would say yes. Whom should that local compliance officer report to? I would advocate that that person reports into the central chief compliance officer globally. It is worth noting that before Walmart had its FCPA issues erupt, Walmart had local compliance officers report into local general counsels who reported into local business presidents around the world. That did not work effectively. It is one of the big changes Walmart made after its FCPA problems became public. And now all of those local units ultimately report into the global compliance officer in Arkansas. The only statistics I have around this are that this is from Deloitte's 2015 Compliance Trend Survey, where they asked that question. They do have local unit CCOs. Out of the 43% who said, yes, we do, came the follow-up question, who does that local person answer to? Less than half of them reported into the global chief compliance officer. I presume then that the majority of those people reported into local business chiefs. I don't see that as a good idea. That gives rise to the opportunity for mini cultures to take root, and especially if you're going to have more of a focus, more of an importance on a good, strong culture, if that has to be on message across all business units, you really need the people who are preaching the gospel locally, all those local compliance officers. They need to be able to have clear lines of communication and power and authority back to the chief compliance officer, who also should be in on the big strategic organization, strategic executive management committee at Central Command. So I think that's the structure that should happen, but I am not necessarily sure that happens at a whole lot of places yet.
Okay, we have another question. While tone from the top is essential, how are decentralized companies addressing tone from the middle management of decentralized business units?
That is another good question that I think that they're not doing it well. I think a lot of companies know it's important, but they don't necessarily know how to do it. I think it is telling that when you look at a lot of these other compliance officer surveys out there, and there are a lot of them, one of the top challenges for compliance officers at other surveys I've seen are employee cynicism. So clearly the message for the middle managers and even lower level employees, like they're not, will reside on tying compensation to ethical behavior and ethical culture. And likewise, I do think that it depends on not cultivating a hard-selling, high-pressure culture. That is how Wells Fargo got into trouble. On a smaller scale, just last week, we saw that's how Credit Suisse got into trouble with its private banking unit. It was reclassifying assets in that case. That was another one where high pressure to perform, to meet goals, was the enemy there. And I think that's, if you don't address that, I don't care how ethical culture sounds, I don't care how your good tone at the top sounds, if the performance is going to be that high pressure, that's going to eat away at the ethical tone you're trying to achieve. So you really need to think about how that works.
All right, so I don't see any more questions for today, and that's good because we're almost at the top of the hour. So I'm going to wrap things up. This does conclude our webinar for today, and if you do have additional questions, please feel free to reach out using the contact information. Oh, we don't have contact information. Can you go to the next slide? Do we have your contact information?
Yes,
we do.
Okay. That's me.
There we go. Or you can reach out to Matt, or you can reach out to www.hiperos.com and use the contact us form on the website. So the slides will be sent out to the audience at the end of this presentation, along with the live links to all the documentation that Matt pointed out. The webcast will be uploaded on our website at the beginning of next week and available for replay in case you missed anything. And we appreciate your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.